How did Jasmine end up exposing a contradiction buried deep inside? The GOP's own talking point about who actually depends on Snap. She didn't need a debate stage, a viral showdown, or a congressional microphone. All it took was one interview, one statistic, and suddenly the entire Republican argument folded under its own weight. Before we walk through the precise way Jasmine Crockett dismantled the Republican narrative surrounding food stamps, using facts they consistently hope nobody brings up. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear explains exactly why the GOP routinely attacks a program that, ironically, helps their own base more than anyone else. Inside the MSNBC studio, everything had that familiar cable news polish. Bright lights, high-definition screens, the subtle hum of controlled chaos. It was supposed to be a routine conversation about the Farm Bill negotiations and the latest Republican proposals to remake SNAP. Nothing unusual, just standard political chatter, the kind that fills hours of daytime news without ever causing a ripple online. But behind the scenes, nobody realized Jasmine Crockett had walked into the studio, carrying a spark, something she had watched moments earlier that lit a fire under her. And when Crockett is fired up, the interview is no longer routine. It becomes unforgettable and often uncomfortably truthful. A few minutes before going on air, she had watched a clip from a Young Americans Foundation conference, one of those conservative youth gatherings where Republican speakers serve up as much outrage as applause lines. The presenter, rising star in conservative media famous for railing against woke culture and Democrat freebies, launched into a high-energy rant about SNAP. And of course, he hit every predictable talking point: the food stamp system. He said, symbolized everything broken in Democratic leadership. According to him, the program was overstuffed, mismanaged, enabling laziness and fostering a dependent underclass feeding off government cheese. He painted an image of people using taxpayer dollars to buy soda, chips, candy, anything that sounded irresponsibly, and the crowd ate it up. He kept going, claiming Democrats deliberately expanded SNAP during Obama's presidency not because poverty rose, but to buy votes through dependency. And then he reached his grand finale. SNAP shouldn't be reformed, should be abolished completely. The moment he finished, the room burst into excited applause. He looked triumphant, convinced he had dropped a bombshell argument. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in Texas, Jasmine Crockett watched the clip and grew visibly irritated. She knew every line of that speech was exaggerated or outright false. So by the time her MSNBC segment began, she was fully prepared to tear each piece apart, one factual blow at a time. The anchor opened with a simple question about the farm bill. Crockett politely answered for a few seconds, then pivoted hard into what she actually wanted to address. Can I talk about something I just watched? She asked calmly, though the focus in her eyes said she was gearing up for something sharp, because it perfectly represents the dishonesty in how Republicans discuss SNAP. And I think we need to separate reality from propaganda. The anchor immediately knew this was better television than a normal policy breakdown and gave her the floor. Crockett didn't hesitate. "I just saw a clip from a conservative youth event," she said, where a speaker claimed SNAP is bloated, corrupt, full of lazy people buying junk food, and that Democrats expanded it to create dependency. And let me be very clear, every part of that narrative is either misleading or completely false. She lifted one finger to start her breakdown. First, the idea that people on SNAP are lazy freeloaders who don't work. Republicans never mention this fact. Over a quarter of all SNAP recipients are working people. People with jobs. People who clock in and out every day. And yet, they still don't earn enough to afford groceries. She continued, her pace quickening. Why is that? Because the minimum wage has been stuck at $7.25, since 2009. That's 15 years with no increase. Meanwhile, everything else, rent, groceries, utilities, healthcare, has skyrocketed. SNAP doesn't support laziness. It supports the working poor who are struggling because wages are stagnant. She leaned in as she spoke, making sure the point landed fully. So when Republicans criticize SNAP users, they're not criticizing unemployed people. They're criticizing working Americans whose jobs simply don't pay enough to survive. The anchor tried to add a question, but Crockett kept going. And here's the part that really exposes Republican hypocrisy, she said. Let's talk about who truly profits off the SNAP program. Her expression sharpened. It's corporations. Big ones, the biggest in America. Walmart employees rely on SNAP more than workers at almost any other major company. Why? Because Walmart keeps wages low. Taxpayers end up covering what Walmart refuses to pay. And then, those same workers use their SNAP dollars at Walmart. That means the Walton family, one of the richest families on earth, benefits from a system they helped create. She paused deliberately. So when Republicans attack SNAP, they're not fighting fraud. They're protecting corporations that underpay workers and then profit again when those workers spend their benefits. But they never mention that part because it destroys their entire narrative. The anchor shifted to the junk food argument. Crockett didn't miss a beat. That argument is insulting and paternalistic, she fired back. Yes, some recipients buy soda or sweets because they're human. But the data shows SNAP households buy nearly the same foods as everyone else. And here's what really matters. Healthy food costs more. When your budget is tiny, you buy what fills your kids' stomachs. That's not a moral failure. It's a result of an economic system that forces families to stretch every dollar. Then she stared directly into the camera. And let's be honest. Republicans truly cared about nutrition. They wouldn't oppose every policy that makes healthy food cheaper or more accessible. They fight against increasing SNAP benefits, subsidizing fruits and vegetables, expanding nutrition programs, everything. So no, this isn't about health. It's about cutting support for poor families. The anchor brought up Josh Hawley's criticism of SNAP. Crockett didn't hold back. Oh, Josh Hawley. Let's talk about him. Do you know which parts of Missouri have the highest SNAP usage? Rural areas. Republican voting areas. The same communities that support him rely heavily on SNAP. So when he attacks the program, he's attacking the people who vote for him. Her voice sharpened. This is the contradiction Republicans pray no one notices. SNAP participation is higher in Republican districts than Democratic ones. Rural America depends on SNAP, yet Republicans convince those same rural voters that the real problem is lazy city dwellers using racial dog whistles to distract from economic reality. The anchor then asked why rural voters still support politicians who want to cut their benefits. Crockett's answer cut straight to the heart of political messaging. Because Republicans are experts at pointing voters toward the wrong enemy, she said. They convince people that black, urban poor folks are abusing the system, even though most SNAP recipients are white and many live in rural communities. She kept building. And here's the deeper truth. When Republicans talk about cutting SNAP, they claim it's about reducing dependency. But they never address why people need SNAP at all. If wages had kept up with productivity, the minimum wage would be over $25 an hour today. But instead, corporations grew richer while workers fell behind. She held up her hand again, listing each point clearly. Republicans gave enormous tax breaks to corporations and billionaires, adding trillions to the deficit. They fight against raising the minimum wage. They weaken unions. They block universal health care, which would lower costs for working families. They oppose every single policy that would actually reduce then need for SNAP, and then they turn around and attack the people who need SNAP backouts of the poverty wage economy. That's Republican policies created. It's absolutely shameless. The anchor brought up the claim from the Young Americans Foundation speaker that Democrats expand SNAP under Obama to create dependency. Crockett's response showed she'd been anticipating this argument too. This is such a dishonest framing of what actually happened. Yes, SNAP. Enrollment increased dramatically during the Obama administration. Y'all know why. Because we were in the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. Unemployment was at 10%. Millions of people lost their jobs through no fault of their own. SNAP did exactly what it's designed to do. It provided a safety net during economy catastrophe. She emphasized each word. That's what the program is for. It expands during recession. People need help, and it contracts during economic growth when people can't support themselves. That's not creating dependency. That's responding to economic conditions. The fact that Republicans frame this as some kind of Democrat scheme shows they either don't understand how counter-cyclical programs work, or they're deliberately lying a booty. She wasn't finished. And you know what happened after the economy recovered? SNAP enrollment declined. It went down as unemployment went down, and wages slowly started improving because most people don't want to be on food stamps. They want jobs that pay enough to support their families. SNAP is what they need when the economy fails them. Not because Democrats are trying to create dependency, but because the alternative is letting people go hungry. The interview was supposed to be a 10-minute segment. It had now gone over 20 minutes with the anchor mostly just facilitating as Crockett systematically dismissed my every Republican talking point about SNAP. But she had one more point to make, and it was the one she clearly considered most important. Here's what this entire debate is really about, and I want to be very direct about this. Republicans don't want to cut SNAP backouts. They care about the deficit or fiscal responsibility or encouraging work. They want to cut SNAP because it's a program that primarily helps poor people. And the Republican economic philosophy is based on the idea that poor people are poor because they're morally deficient. That poverty is a personal failure rather than a structural condition created by policychoices. She continued her voice-carrying conviction. If you believe poverty is about personal failure, then government programs to address poverty are enabling bad behavior. But if you understand that poverty is about wages being too low, housing being too expensive, healthcare bankrupting, FOMIs, education being unaffordable, then government programs to address poverty are necessary responses to systemic problems. That's the fundamental philosophical divide, and Republicans are on the wrong side of it. She looked directly at the camera again. The speaker at that Young Americans Foundation event said we should end SNAP, not reform it. You know what that means? That means letting people go hungry. That means children not having Gina to eat. That means elderly people in fixed incomes choosing between food and medicine. That means disabled people can't work, not being able to afford groceries. That's what ending SNAP means in the real world. And anyone advocating for that is advocating for cruelty disguised as fiscal responsibility. Then our view wrapped shortly after that, but the impact extended far beyond the MSNBC audience. Clips from the segment went viral across social media, with different soundbites resonating with different audiences. Progressive activist shared her explanation of how SNAP subsidizes corporate underpayment of workers. Rural advocacy groups shared her point about Republican districting more heavily on SNAP. Anti-poverty organizations shared her dismantling of the dependency narrative. Most significantly, her comment about Josh Hawley attacking a program his own constituents relied on prompted renewed scrutiny of how rural Republicans talked about SNAP versus how their districts actually use the program. Reporters started pulling data showing that yes, Many of the loudest SNAP critics in Congress represented districts with above-average SNAP utilization. The contradiction Crockett had highlighted wasn't theoretical. It was measurable, documentable. Conservative media tried to respond, but they were hampered by the fact that Crockett hadn't made any claims that were factually disputable. SNAP recipients are disproportionately employed. That's true. Wages haven't kept pace with costs. That's true. Rural areas have high SNAP utilization. That's true. Republican districts often have more SNAP recipients than Democratic districts. That's true. Corporate employees on poverty wages use SNAP at high rates. That's true. Every major point she'd made was backed by data that Republicans couldn't effectively along. So they were left attacking her motivations or making vague claims about Democrat talking points without addressing the substance. Office released a statement claiming Crockett was trying to distract from the real issue of government dependency, but notably didn't address her specific point about his Missouri constituents relying on the program he wanted to cut. It was a deflection that confirmed rather than refuted her argument. 3 days after the interview, a fascinating leak emerged. An internal Republican strategy committee mimoshed anonymously with several news outlets showed GOP leadership discussing the political dangers of their SNAP rhetoric. The memo explicitly acknowledged that many of our strongest districts have above-average SNAP utilization and warned that direct attacks on the program create a vulnerability if Democrats effectively address the impact. It advised members to focus on waste and fraud rather than overall program size and to avoid specific cut numbers that can be used against us. The memo was essential adenosines that everything Crockett had said was correct. That Republicans' new theory rhetoric about SNAP didn't match reality of who used the program and that their base voters would be hurt by the cuts they were proposing. They just hoped that cultural messaging and racial coding would prevent those voters from making the connection. Crockett responded to the leaked memo with a statement that summarized her entire argument. This memo proves what I've been saying. Republicans know that attacking SNAP hurts their own voters. They know the program is necessary and popular. They're just betting that they can use culture war distractions on racial grievance politics to get Pleto support, cutting a program they rely. It's cynical, it's manipulative, and that's proof that their supposed principles about government dependency are just cover for their real goal. Cutting programs that help poor Pleto fund tax cuts for rich people. In a follow-up appearance, Crockett was asked if she thought her MSNBC interview had changed the debate around SNAP. Herons were reflected both her legal precision and her political realism. I didn't know if one interview changes at a bet that's been happening for decades. But what I do know is that when you present facts clearly and challenge false narratives directly, you force people to either engage with reality or reveal that they're not interested in reality. Republicans can keep claiming a SNAP creates dependency and laziness. But now everyone knows that many of their own voters rely on the program. They can keep claiming it's bloated. But no, everyone knows it's keeping working people fed because wages are too low. The truth is out there now. Whether it changes policy depends on whether voters hold politicians accountable for the truth. If this breakdown of how Jasmine Crockett used one interview to expose Republican lie about SNAP showed why understanding who actually used government programs matters for political debates. Hit that like button. Subscribe for more analysis of theme moments when facts demolish talking points. Drop a comment telling us whether you think Republicans will ever admit their SNAP rhetoric doesn't match reality. And share this with anyone who needs to understand that the people there told to blame for government spending aren't the people actually been fighting most from government policy. Your engagement helps us keep highlighting the disconnect between political rhetoric and documented reality.